This video is sponsored by Brilliant.org. Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek here and welcome back to the channel. I often feature on the channel filters that I love to use, like this kind of filter from Altair Astro or that kind of filter from Askar, which I've reviewed on the channel recently. And those filters are what we call multi-band filters. They let in some specific colors of light and block all of the others. And that lets us get great pictures of emission nebulae with simple one-shot color cameras without having to use monochrome astrophotography cameras that a lot of advanced amateurs use. That said, this kind of filter it raises a lot of questions, and I get a lot of questions about how we can use those filters. Can we stack those filters? Can we use them with monochrome sensors? Should I be using a tri-band or a quad-band filter? Or can I use like a single band filter, like an H-alpha filter with a color camera, and what's going to be the result? And am I worried about H-beta filtering into the signal? And tons of super interesting questions like that. And I am here to answer them, and I promise you, you will learn stuff, because there are a lot of subtleties that come with using those filters, and sometimes it's not as simple as it appears. So strap on and let's get to it. So let's first start with the principles behind using all of those multi-band or single band or dual band or tri-band or whatever band filters, which has to do with emission nebulae and light pollution. So emission nebulae are nebulae whose atoms of hydrogen and oxygen within that are like floating in space emit light themselves. They don't need to reflect light from a star. They actually emit their own light, and that's why they're called emission nebulae. And what's really cool is that emission nebulae will emit light at specific wavelength, so at specific colors. And that's where the idea of filtering to capture only those colors comes from. Because if you're in a light polluted city like here in Tokyo, there's a lot of light pollution across the whole color spectrum. So it's like noise from light pollution regardless of what color you are capturing. But if you can limit yourself to a sliver of color, then you only get the light pollution from that sliver of color, while maintaining all of the signal from that particular color, and it so happens to be the exact color, the exact wavelength that is emitted as signal by emission nebulae. And the principle of it is that basically those atoms of hydrogen, oxygen, etc., that are floating in space, they're still being like bombarded by radiation from stars, for instance. They get ionized. So what's going to happen is after a while that electron will just like go down towards a lower level of energy and kind of like settle into a more stable position within the atom, roughly speaking. And because energy has to go somewhere, it emits a photon at a very specific wavelength when it happens. And we have atoms of hydrogen that will emit photons like that in wavelengths that we call, like for instance, H-alpha, H-beta. We have atoms of oxygen that will do that as well with a wavelength that is very interesting to us, which is oxygen 3. And we have atoms of sulfur that will emit as well, like sulfur 2, which is a wavelength. And depending on the wavelengths, they're in completely different color spectrum. So let's have a look at the wavelengths bandpass chart of a specific filter that is no longer made because the company making it has gone bankrupt. RIP. But here we are, and you can see we have like H-beta, oxygen 3, H-alpha, sulfur 2, which I just mentioned, and you can see the relative colors. We can see oxygen 3 is kind of like between blue and green, H-beta is in the green, H-alpha is in the red, and sulfur 2 is in a deep red. And while these are band passes, so they appear somewhat thick, the actual wavelength emitted by the emission nebula is like a spot. It's a single line, a very precise line. It has no width. It has no thickness on this particular chart. And this chart, I should have mentioned that a bit earlier. On the x-axis, we have the wavelength, so the color that is being transmitted. And on the y-axis, we have for that particular filter, how much of that color it passes, it transmits down to the camera sensor. So here we have an example of filter that is quad band. It passes 4 different band passes very precisely. And also on this chart, you can see like Hg, which is mercury, Na, which is for sodium. And this is because we have, in the old days, we used to use street lighting that was relying on mercury and sodium kind of elements. So they were emitting light in specifically those wavelengths. And so by retaining only H beta, oxygen 3, H alpha, sulfur 2, for instance, then we could get completely rid of a majority of the light pollution. Obviously, these days with LEDs, this is no longer workable. LEDs, they have a spectrum that goes like all across the visible spectrum. So we cannot completely filter out LED light pollution, unfortunately. But let's look at some other filter examples. This is a filter that I showed recently on the channel, where you can see we have like a thicker bandpass of the filter on the left. So this is in the blue and blue-green kind of spectrum. And then on the right, we have somewhat thick bandpass in the red. So this filter only has two bandpasses, but the bandpass on the left is thick enough or wide enough that it passes both H beta and oxygen 3, and the bandpass on the right is thin enough that it only passes H alpha. And this is another example of a filter where you can see it has two very big band passes, but within those very wide band passes, it passes H beta, oxygen 3, H alpha, and sulfur 2. But compared to this filter that we saw earlier, it will include more light pollution because it has wider band passes and it covers more colors that are being used by light pollution but not used by the emission nebula. And so those charts, they let you get a good idea of the characteristics of a filter, assuming the filter you buy actually performs up to specs, but that's a completely different topic. I have a video about the filter lottery. I'll put the link up above if you're interested. Sometimes what you're buying is not what you're getting. But there is one thing that is not quite visible on this chart and that is often ignored by amateur photographers when we make a purchase, is how much light off band is blocked. So you can see this particular filter, it passes two band passes. But what about like the flat parts here near zero? How well does the filter actually block the unwanted colors of light, the unwanted wavelength? This is something that is qualified in the filter specifications. It's the OD factor, basically. And if I look at the specifications of that filter, you can see you have the barrier property, or the off-band blocking, and it is OD3. This means that this filter passes off-band in the actual colors of light that we don't want to get into our camera. It still passes 0.1% of light. The way you compute it is basically it's 1 over 10 to the power of 3. Or in here 1 over 1000, which is 0.1%. If it was OD4, then it would be 1 over 10 to the power of 4, so 1/10,000th, which would be 0.01%, 10 times better. So this off-band blocking is actually a very important spec that you should be looking at, especially if you live in a very light polluted city. Okay, so now we understand what those filters do. They pass wavelengths or colors of light, and it so happens that they pass exactly the wavelengths of color or correlate of lights that we want to capture from emission nebulae. H alpha, H beta, oxygen 3, sulfur 2. There's also some other stuff like N2, which is important for a type of emission nebula called planetary nebulae. I won't really get into those details right now. And those filters, they pass those wavelengths more or less efficiently. Like some filters are very narrow around that particular wavelength, so they reject a lot of light pollution, and other filters are much wider, much broader. And so they do include the signal that we want, but they include also a lot of light pollution. And typically, wider bandpass filters are easier and cheaper to manufacture than narrower bandpass filters. So that's why they tend to be much cheaper. There's no free lunch, unfortunately, and you get what you pay for. There is, by the way, a common myth or misconception that if you buy very narrowband filters, your image is going to be dimmer, and so you have to expose longer. And therefore, if your mount cannot allow those very long exposures, or your equipment is not up to it, then it's better to get like a wider bandpass filter because it lets you expose for shorter amounts of time. Assuming the filters are performing up to specs, which might not always be the case, this is actually not true, because even if you have a super narrowband filter, very, very narrow around the wavelength that you want to capture, you still get 100% or mostly 100% of that particular color, of that particular wavelength that is emitted by, say, the hydrogen atoms in the nebula that you want to image. So you get the same amount of signal as a wider filter, but you just get less of the light pollution. So it's just much better. Now, to take advantage of that fully, it is better to expose longer, but you don't have to. Even if you expose for shorter amounts of time, you will still get a better signal to noise ratio, so a less noisy result, a better result in the end if you use a narrower filter compared to a broader filter, especially if you're in a light polluted area. I have a whole video on the topic, so I'll put the link up above as well if you're interested. Now I want to talk a little bit about how there is another filter in our imaging train, and this is a filter that is integrated in your camera sensor if you're using one-shot color cameras. But before we do that, you've noticed that there is a lot of math and science and physics that is involved in astrophotography. It's what makes it such a fascinating hobby to me. But obviously, if you're up to date on the basics of math and physics, it makes your understanding and your practical knowledge of the hobby much better, and it's so much more of a pleasure if you do. And if you feel like you're lacking there, well, there is a great way to get up to speed on that, and it is to use brilliant.org. In my opinion, Brilliant is one of the best ways to get up to speed on math, physics, computer science, and all of those geeky topics, because it provides you with very short but to the point and super understandable lessons in those topics using super intuitive and interactive visualizations, so you get a grasp on the topic so easily compared to back when I was learning in like high school and university. And it covers topics that go from really basic, if you really want to start from the beginning, to quite advanced as well. And all of those, they're presented in short lessons. So as a busy man, I have a full-time job, I work on YouTube, etc. Whenever I have downtime, instead of scrolling through social media, I'll be just looking at Brilliant, because it's just so much more fun, and I'm training my brain, and it really makes me feel good about myself too. And also, like Brilliant, they add new lessons every month. So I never get bored, there's always something new to learn. And these days I've gone back to a machine learning course, which was actually super advanced, and so I had to polish up some of my mathematical skills first, also using Brilliant, but now I'm back on the course, and it's a lot of fun. So I highly recommend Brilliant, and if you want to try out Brilliant for free for a full month, you should go to brilliant.org/quivlazygeek, and the first 200 of you will get 20% off their premium annual subscription. Okay, where were we? Yes, let's go back to a second series of filters that you have in your imaging train if you're using a color camera, and these are the filters that are directly on your camera sensor, and they're called the Bayer matrix. The gist of it is that you'll have light hitting your camera lens or your telescope. It goes through the filter that we already mentioned, like a dual, let's say a dual band filter, and then it will go to your camera sensor. And each of the pixels on your camera sensor has a single color filter. It might be red, it might be green, and it might be blue. And actually on your camera sensor, 1/4 of the pixels are covered by a red filter, 1/4 are covered by a blue filter, and 2/4 or 1/2 are covered by a green filter. And this is because our eyes are more sensitive to green, and so camera makers and sensor makers went with this particular pattern, the Bayer pattern. And so in theory, a pixel that is covered by a blue filter will only capture the blue color of light. And a pixel that is covered by a green filter, it will only capture green. And a pixel that is covered by a red filter will only capture red. And the pixels themselves, they don't understand light. They're just monochrome, but because they're covered by each of those color filters, we can use them and say like, oh yeah, thanks to this pixel that is covered by a blue filter, I know the intensity of blue light for this particular location on my sensor. And then we use an operation called debayering to extrapolate a full color image based on the information we got from each pixels covered by a different color filter. But one thing that is not often realized is that a pixel covered by a blue filter does not capture only blue, and a pixel covered by a green filter doesn't capture only green, and you guessed it, a pixel covered by a red filter does not capture only red. Let's have a look. So on my screen here I have the wavelength or response of my filters, or the Bayer filters on top of the camera sensor for a very popular color camera, which is the ASI 2600 MC Pro, which uses the IMX571 sensor from Sony. And so this is valid for pretty much all of the cameras that are based on the same sensor. And this is exactly the same principle. We have the wavelength as the x-axis and the transmittance on the y-axis. Well, not quite the transmittance, but an indicator of how much light from each color makes it in the end. And most of the light that interests us resides between like 400 and 700 nanometers. So for now, let's kind of ignore the part that is to the right here and just look at this middle line effectively and look only at the part to the left. Let's look at the green filter. And let's look at where H alpha is located. H alpha is roughly here. So you can see the green filter will happily transmit roughly or register roughly 15% of H alpha, even though H alpha is in the red. And even the red filter, if we look at around oxygen 3 here, it will transfer roughly 3-4% of the oxygen 3 signal. And the blue filter here will transmit H beta. It will also transmit here oxygen 3, which is fine and expected, but it will also happily transmit around like 5 to 10% of H alpha and sulfur 2 as well, just like the green filter will also transmit maybe like over 20% of sulfur 2. So there is going to be some mixing going on there despite having those color filters. So now let's address some specific scenarios, starting with a very common question: can I use a monoband filter, like a filter that passes only oxygen 3 or only H alpha, and can I use that with a color camera? Okay, well, let's think about it. An H alpha filter, let's take an H alpha filter. It has a single band. It will only transmit one color, one wavelength, which is in the red. What this means is that if I'm using a color sensor, only 1/4 of my pixels are covered by a red filter. So only 1/4 of my pixels will pass the color red, and only the color red is being passed by my additional single band filter that is in my imaging train. And so the usual way of thinking of it is, okay, you can use an H alpha single band filter with a one-shot color camera, but only 1/4 of your pixels will be used. So you're like throwing away 3/4 of your sensor. And thus you're losing out on both resolution and signal to noise ratio. And this is broadly true, but not quite 100% true, because as we saw with the earlier chart of the wavelength responses of the Bayer filters on top of your camera sensor, the green pixels, half of your sensor, will still register something like 15%, maybe even more depending on the camera sensor, of the H alpha red color that is being transmitted to you. And maybe the blue filter will take roughly 8% of H alpha and gets even higher for sulfur 2. So the statement that only 1/4 of your pixels is being used if you are using a single band filter, especially like H alpha or sulfur 2, is not accurate. It is an approximation, but you are not as bad off as you would think you are. And because H alpha is actually a very strong signal from emission nebulae, H alpha is really, really strong, and you can gather a very high signal to noise ratio on H alpha in a very short time. And this is because emission nebulae, they're mostly hydrogen atoms. Then even if you're using only 1/4 of your pixels and you're actually using the whole sensor just as at different transmittances, effectively, then it's worth it if you just want to add, the precision, the details that H alpha can offer. And you only have a color camera, and you want to have like that additional punch in your images that H alpha can bring, especially like galaxy images, and you want to have the nebulae within the galaxy like pop more. and you don't want to invest in a monochrome camera, then absolutely yes, an H-alpha filter that can help a lot with that. You'll just have your full color broadband image of the galaxy in one session of imaging, and then in a second session of imaging you'll be concentrating on H-alpha. And because H-alpha is such a strong signal on most nebulae, on most emission nebulae, it will work great. You really won't have any issues. Sure, you would be better off using monochrome sensor with your H-alpha filter, but OSC, or like one-shot color, can also give you great results there. It becomes a bit less true for sulfur 2, where the signal is much weaker than H-alpha, and where I think the gap between one-shot color and monochrome becomes much more pronounced. And in the other side of the spectrum, if you're going to use oxygen 3 with a one-shot color camera, well, there you have like basically 3/4 of your camera sensor is being used because the blue pixels and the green pixels are being used. So much less of an issue there. Feel free to use a one-shot color camera with oxygen 3 only filter. So now we've looked at the case of using a single band filter with a color sensor. Let's talk about using multi-band filters. Let's say like dual band filters, H-alpha oxygen 3 and say oxygen 3 sulfur 2 type of filters with your color camera. There's actually a lot of fun stuff that happens that I haven't mentioned in my videos before, but they're very visible when you're processing your images in PixInsight, and I'll show you that in a moment. But before we go there, I'd like to ask you to quickly click the like button, leave a comment down in the video, subscribe if you're new to the channel, in which case welcome, and if you want to support me and keep me making long research videos like that, because it's a lot of work, you can also join my Patreon, link down in the description, or join the channel as a member. You guys make the channel possible. There's no other way around it, so thank you so much. And you guys will be included in the credits of this video because it's going to be much longer than 20 minutes. And also some ranks of my Patreon supporters get access to my videos in advance and ad-free. But anyway, yes, let's get back to those like dual band filters, which I've reviewed on the channel before. And there is a very interesting phenomenon that will happen with those filters. So you can see right now I am in PixInsight. And I have here the result of an exposure using the sulfur 2 oxygen 3 filter. So 2 bands, sulfur 2, oxygen 3. And then I have another one that uses here H-alpha and oxygen 3. So just as expected, they are different. On the sulfur 2 oxygen 3, we have a really nice color palette. I really love that, and this is because both oxygen 3 and sulfur 2 are relatively weak. So one will not overwhelm the other. They're like roughly of the same strength. In the H-alpha, oxygen 3, then we have like H-alpha is so strong that it completely overwhelms oxygen 3. At first glance, I don't see any blue color in that image or any blue-green color in that image. But we can still extract the individual channels, red, green, and blue channels of each of those images. And so from when I extract the red, green, and blue channels from this particular sulfur 2 oxygen 3 image, the red channel will correspond to sulfur 2, and I will say that a mixture of blue and green channel will correspond to oxygen 3. And similarly, for the H-alpha oxygen 3 image that I have here, once I extract the red, green, and blue, I can say the red channel will correspond to H-alpha, and then the green and blue channels merged together will correspond to oxygen 3. And this is because H-alpha is in the red end of the spectrum, sulfur 2 is also on the red end of the spectrum, and oxygen 3 is in the blue-green part of the spectrum. So it all makes sense, and let's have a look. This is H-alpha, extracted as the red channel of the H-alpha oxygen 3 filter. And this is sulfur 2 extracted from the sulfur 2 oxygen 3 filter as the red channel. And you can see H-alpha has a much better signal to noise ratio compared to sulfur 2. And this is simply because H-alpha is much stronger as a signal than sulfur 2. But you can see the structures that we see in sulfur 2 and H-alpha, they're somewhat different. So it's very interesting to be able to combine those into a final image. Okay, so now we have H-alpha sulfur 2, and because both of my filters, the H-alpha oxygen 3 and the sulfur 2 oxygen 3, they capture oxygen 3 in exactly the same way, I would expect the result from each of those filters, the merging of blue and green channels for each of those filters, to be roughly identical, assuming we have the same total exposure time for both of those filters. And it's not at all. Let me show you. This on the right is the oxygen 3 extracted from the H-alpha oxygen 3 filter. On the left, this is the oxygen 3 extracted from the sulfur 2 oxygen 3 filter. They have roughly the same amount of exposure time, as I recall. Can you spot a slight difference between the two? Yes, you can, and so can I. So why is that? Why are we seeing such wildly different results, even though both filters they transmit oxygen 3 in exactly the same way? I've checked them via my spectrometer. Well, we have to go back to the Bayer matrix, those small red, green, and blue filters that are on each of our pixels. And remember that both the green filtered pixels and the blue filtered pixels, they both pass some amount of H-alpha and sulfur 2. But H-alpha is a much stronger signal than sulfur 2, so it passes into the blue and green channels of my camera sensor, and it contaminates the oxygen 3. And so we get a much better looking image, but it is less accurate than the image on the left, which also filters through some sulfur 2 into the oxygen 3 channel, effectively into the blue and green channels. But because sulfur 2 is a much weaker signal, it interferes much less with the data. And so this is where we have a fundamental difference between color sensors and monochrome sensors when doing monochrome imaging, or when doing narrowband imaging in particular. Monochrome sensors can fully isolate sulfur 2, H-alpha, and oxygen 3 and other wavelengths as well, whereas the color camera sensor cannot do that because of the way that the Bayer matrix pixels work. But fret not, you can still achieve amazing results with one-shot color cameras, and in fact I myself was using monochrome cameras for a long while, and I stopped doing so because I didn't want to deal with all of those filters anymore, and I went back to one-shot color, and I'm very happy with it. Also, to note, I've seen many imagers using monochrome cameras and narrowband actually mix in some H-alpha into like their oxygen 3 channels, somewhat using like pixel mask, that kind of stuff. And we're doing the same thing naturally. Plus, if you have like both of those filters, you actually have access to oxygen 3 with very light contamination from sulfur 2 and oxygen 3 with a higher contamination with H-alpha. And so when you want to create your final oxygen 3 channel, you can mix those two results and to taste, right? If you want to be scientifically accurate, you could mix with a very strong weight on the oxygen 3 channel of your oxygen 3 sulfur 2 filter compared to the other one. So now let's talk about the scenario of multi-band filters. It's no longer 2 band passes, but like 3-4 band passes. So we go back to the earlier example, and there are tons of filters still made that have the same kind of principle, where we have, like here, 4 very narrow band passes on target wavelengths. So this one, H-beta, oxygen 3, H-alpha, and sulfur 2. Or this particular filter, which is like 2 band passes, but they also cover H-beta, oxygen 3, H-alpha, and sulfur 2. The only difference between the two filters is that this one will perform much less well in light polluted areas because it emits a lot more light pollution. So what is the point of those filters? Well, I personally don't really like them, and I don't think they're super useful. Especially this kind of filter, which is very narrow across all of those 4 wavelengths. To me, it's kind of a waste of narrow band passes. The reason being that, okay, you're using, presumably, a one-shot color camera, right? So you have some pixels are most sensitive to red, some are most sensitive to blue, some are most sensitive to green. So let's look at H-alpha and sulfur 2. Well, your red pixels, or the red filtered pixels, will be the ones reacting to that and registering that. But they're basically going to both be merged and squashed together in the red channel. Once they're in the red channel, you have no way of splitting them again, because you're capturing them together and they're being registered at the same time by the same pixels. And take into account that H alpha is so much stronger than sulfur 2. Sulfur 2 just becomes completely drowned in H alpha. So this thing, having those two bandpasses there for your one-shot color camera, doesn't make any sense to me. Basically, you're going to get the same result as if you had only the H alpha bandpass. So what about like the two bandpasses on the left here, H beta and oxygen 3? Here, oxygen 3 will be registered mostly by the green filtered pixels on your camera, to some extent the blue ones as well, and H beta will be registered mostly by the blue filtered pixels on your camera. So in theory, we'd be able to split them. In the blue channel would have H beta, and the green channel would have oxygen 3. And remember that both would still be contaminated to some extent by H alpha. But even ignoring that contamination by H alpha in both of those channels, green and blue, I'm not a big fan of H beta in general as a bandpass or as a wavelength to capture, because H beta is a complete echo of H alpha. You're basically going to see the same structures from your nebula in general. So to me, there's no big advantage of capturing H beta, because it doesn't provide any more relevant information to us, because we already have it with H alpha. And H alpha is so much stronger and gives us so much better signal to noise ratio that, in my opinion, it makes H beta kind of useless. So with these filters, what's happening from my point of view is that we have created very narrow bandpasses across those four wavelengths, but the sulfur 2 bandpass is kind of useless because it gets completely overwhelmed by H alpha, and the H beta bandpass is kind of useless because it's a complete echo of H alpha. It captures information that we already have, and H alpha is so strong that we don't really need it. So the only thing that those two bandpasses, H beta and sulfur 2, do, they let in more light pollution that we don't need. And so in my opinion, a simple H alpha oxygen 3 dual band filter or sulfur 2 oxygen 3 dual band filter is much better. And talking about H beta, by the way, there are standalones like sulfur 2 H beta filter by Antlia that provides a filter like that. I have the same criticism about it as well. It's like, why bother capturing H beta if you've already captured H alpha and oxygen 3 via a different filter? Because H alpha, you already have it, super strong signal. H beta is just an echo of that. It's not going to be useful when we combine the images from both filters. If you're just going to be using, although as a standalone, a sulfur 2 H beta filter can make a lot of sense as a standalone if you're not going to combine it with other data, because both H beta and sulfur 2, they're weak, and they're weak together, right? So one doesn't overwhelm the other. So if you're looking for a nice way to combine like the hydrogen signal with the sulfur 2 signal and just like split it without needing multiple filters, then the H beta sulfur 2 on its own, not used together with other filters, makes a lot of sense, and should give you a cool image, because you'll have like hydrogen data associated with the blue pixels and to some extent the green ones as well, and sulfur 2 associated with the red pixels, and the color palette should be looking really nice without doing much processing. I unfortunately don't own any of those filters, so I cannot say more on the topic, but as a standalone filter, I think it's a cool idea. As a set together with an oxygen 3 H alpha filter, it makes less sense because we already have the H alpha channel available to us. Okay, and so now let's go to another scenario, which is, what about using one of my multi-band filters with a monochrome camera? Would that work? And the answer is yes, it would work. But because your monochrome camera has no way of splitting color channels later on, it will just squash everything together. And remember, H alpha is super powerful. So if your filter passes H alpha together with other wavelengths, you can kiss those other wavelengths goodbye, basically. H alpha will overwhelm everything else. And so by using a multi-band filter, let's say oxygen 3 H alpha, with a monochrome camera, well, you'll have a very good approximation of just an H-alpha filter, because Oxygen 3 will not bring much more information to the image. And I would see Oxygen 3 as just like bringing in unneeded light pollution, especially since like LED spectrum is stronger in the blue-green side of things than it is in the red side of things. So you'd be much better off having just a single bandpass filter H-alpha. And you could try, I guess, like sulfur 2 and oxygen 3 together. So again, like you have no way of splitting them, so they get just merged together, but at least their relative strengths are similar. You'd basically have the same result as if you had taken like a sulfur 2 image with a single band sulfur 2 filter and an oxygen 3 image with a single band oxygen 3 filter, and you had mixed the two together later on in post-processing. Are there use cases for that? I'm not sure, but you know, if you want to have fun and you have like multi-band filters lying around together with a monochrome camera, have fun. There are no rules in the hobby. I'm just providing information for you to act on. Do whatever you like. It's always fun to experiment. Okay, and another question that I've gotten quite a bit is, what about stacking multiple multi-band filters together? For instance, I have my H-alpha oxygen 3 filter. I have my sulfur 2 oxygen 3 filter. Can I just like stack them one after the other in my imaging train? So the light goes through the first one, then through the second one, and then to my camera sensor. Would that let me capture it all at once? H-alpha, sulfur 2, and oxygen 3 without having to buy a multi-band filter that could do the same thing. Well, first, obviously, you've seen from earlier in the video, I'm not such a big fan of multi-band filters that have both oxygen 3, H-alpha, and sulfur 2 because of the way they just like completely crush the sulfur 2 with H-alpha, and you have no way of splitting them afterwards. But also, just this, like going through multiple filters in this particular case will not work, because your H-alpha oxygen 3 filter, it passes H-alpha, it passes oxygen 3, it blocks everything else. So it blocks sulfur 2. And then we go to the sulfur 2 oxygen 3 filter. It passes oxygen 3, it passes sulfur 2, but it blocks everything else. So it blocks H-alpha. So this one blocks sulfur 2. This one blocks H-alpha. Put two of them together. Both of them pass oxygen 3. So you'll have a single band oxygen 3 filter with this. But yeah, I mean, if you have a monochrome sensor, you've just bought a monochrome sensor, and you already have those two filters, and you don't want to invest in a pure oxygen 3 monoband filter, I guess this can work. It will hurt your transmittance, and you might have some weird halos because you'd have like reflections going in between those two filters, but it's fun. Experiment, have fun. And if it saves you a few $100s because it works well enough, why not? But that's the only use case that I can think of for stacking filters. So when you stack filters, just, well, first don't do it in general, but you can think about like, okay, this filter passes what and blocks what, and this filter passes what and blocks what, and only what both filters pass will end up reaching your camera sensor. Okay, and now we're going to go to another question, which is, what is beyond 700 nanometers when we go into infrared? And this is relevant because I have like a multi-band filter here. It's called the IDAS GNB. And this is how its bandpass graph looks like. This is the white line that we're looking at. You see it passes stuff around the oxygen 3 side of things. It passes stuff around the H-alpha side of things. And then it passes stuff like around 800 nanometers to 900 nanometers. This is beyond the visible spectrum. These are colors that we cannot see. This is completely infrared. But even though we cannot see that infrared, if I look at the Bayer matrix characteristics of this very popular camera sensor, we can see that beyond 800 to like 900 or even 1000, it passes between 10% and like 45% of the relative transmittance. I'm not going to go into the details, but it still passes quite a bit of data. And so, even if your eye cannot see those wavelengths, your sensor can. And also, those wavelengths, they're very little affected by light pollution. So LED spectrum doesn't really get there. We don't really have a lot of light pollution in infrared, which is good. So when you want to image like galaxies, this filter works quite well, although you'll have trouble with like color balance. And also one of the characteristics of infrared is that it can actually pierce through dust. So if you are imaging a galaxy with dust lanes, well, you might get better signal to noise ratio on the galaxy because you're capturing the infrared side of things. But at the same time, those dust lanes become kind of transparent to your camera sensor. Especially when looking back at the camera sensor specifications, all of your pixels will pass that infrared wavelength. So you'll have fewer details in the dust lanes of the galaxy, but the broad nebulosity around the galaxy will have better signal to noise ratio. So it's a bit of a give and take kind of thing going on there. But this is a type of filter that is available, and it's been rendered a bit popular as well. I've seen several other filters do that after IDAS did their thing there. And it's a very interesting use case. So you can see that there's a lot of fun we can have with different filter wavelengths and capturing different colors of the spectrum, or even outside of the visible spectrum. And I find that absolutely incredible. And that's it. This is all I have for you in this video. It was a very long video. I'm so sorry about this. And I hope you can watch it and re-watch it, because I really put all of my knowledge and wisdom accumulated over years. And as always, this video is made possible 100% by you guys, my viewers. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, let me know what you think about this video. Do you have tips and tricks about those multi-band filters? Do you disagree with me? Put it down in the comments, and then if you're on the fence about like buying a filter or anything, you'll want to watch the video, but also check the comments down below to double check what others think of this. And this is really the only way that the YouTube algorithm notices my videos and provides them to more people. And I think this is a wealth of knowledge, a mine of knowledge that I hope a lot of beginning astrophotographers can get their hands on. So your help is much appreciated. And if you want to help the channel in general, you can join my Patreon, link down in the description, or join my channel as a member, because this has been a long video. You guys will be in the credits of this video at the time of editing of the video. And some ranks of my Patreon have access to my videos in advance and without ads. But okay, I've been droning on long enough. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. And don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars. And I'll see you next time.